Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery, today is Chapter 6, Season of Fear. The memory of his mother, of Fuzzy and Runty, faded from the mind of Yellow Eyes as the summer waned, and fall laid her splendor over the great hills. The one memory which remained was the picture of Fuzzy and Runty struggling with the pack of hounds beneath the juniper at the edge of the granite slide. That scene was stamped upon his mind indelibly. It saved him twice that summer, from the pack of dogs and from Cougar George, the human. Yellow Eyes avoided trees as a hiding place when trailed by the dogs. He headed straight for the broken rock slides of the high country and the fastness of his cave. Cougar George had fumed and threatened and worked, but the young cougar had escaped him each time he picked up the king cat's trail. Treon watched the play between hunter and killer, and a wide smile came to his sun-bronzed face. The little Chimbika was doing just what he had hoped. Treon could not know how Yellow Eyes had come to learn this vital lesson, but it pleased him that the cougar knew the secret of safety. Through those fall evenings, Yellow Eyes hunted and rambled. The aspens decked themselves in pigments of flaming yellow for a day or two, and flaunted a riot of color until a blast of chill wind swept down from the new snow on Sleepy Cat Mountain and stripped them bare. The scrub oaks below the aspen belt flamed with red and gold and sapphire. The Oregon grape spread clusters of berries against scarlet leaves. Yellow Eyes moved warily over the carpet of leaves. He did not like the rustle his padded feet stirred as he slid along. On a ridge overlooking the valley, he faced into his first snowstorm. A white mass of whirling sleet and frosty particles of ice hurled down off the battlements above and tore at him as he stood with feet planted wide and faced the storm. Something fierce and wild stirred to life within his chest, and he snarled into the raging blast, daring the elements to sweep him from his ledge. From that day on, snow lay in the deep spruce woods and on the shaded slopes. Among the deer, the does began to drift down into the lower country. Only the bucks, whose horns had hardened to lances of bone, remained high up. One morning, Yellow Eyes stood, just at dawn, on the edge of a clearing and looked over a meadow. The air was crystal clear and very cold. Frost whitened the dry grass and shone against the green of the balsam and spruce. Two bucks, a 4-point and a 2-point, were feeding at the edge of the timber. Yellow Eyes was lying on his belly beside a fallen log. He was as motionless as the log itself, except for the tip of his tail. The little black tuft which tipped his long tail twitched and waved like a tiny flag. This is the hunting sign among cougars. It is never still. Possibly it acts as a signal to other cougars that a deer is being stalked and that aid is not wished or needed. Yellow Eyes was feeling the urge to stalk the 2-point buck. He had killed every kind of smaller animal, but he had never attacked a buck. Many times he had worked for an hour or two to get the windward of a doe or a fawn, only to have his rushing leap fail him when he broke cover for the kill. His lithe body was too small, his leaps too short to allow him to strike down his prey. Yet he always tried, and his anger when he failed was like the storm on the crest of Sleepy Cat Mountain. The two bucks moved toward him slowly. He had the wind in his favor, and they did not suspect his presence. As they grazed, each kept a sharp watch along the timber line. Their big ears poised and set themselves attentively every few minutes as they listened for any sound of attack. The deer lives because he is alert and speedy. Those of his kind who grow careless pay for it with their lives. Only the wary and quick-leaping live to maturity. The amber eyes of the yellow cougar closed to mere slits, and his head dropped to his paws. His hind legs drew up under him, and his claws unsheathed and sheathed nervously as he waited. The 2-point would come close to the fallen log if he followed the present course of his feeding. The October dawn was fast clearing the scene. Yellow Eyes knew that mule deer would soon slip into the timber to hide away for the day. Nervously, he waited and watched. His ability to lie motionless and still was a trait he had inherited from a long line of killers. Hours might pass, but he would not move. The 2-point paused and lifted his head. He stared into the timber above his head of the crouching cat. A step or two more would bring him to where Yellow Eyes could reach him in 2 leaps. The youngster fixed his eyes upon the first spot where his padded feet would land, a bare place free of frost-slick grass. The second leap would land him on the back of his prey. Slowly, the 2-point lowered his head and pulled a mouthful of grass. His teeth chomped at it as he ground it and swallowed it. He took another step, and the muscles under the pliant hide of the young cougar tightened. His head flattened, and his lips pulled back from his fangs. Slowly, his hindquarters doubled under him. Then something happened, so unexpected and so terrifying that Yellow Eyes froze like a rigid statue. A rifle thundered from behind the young killer. 2 more shots followed the first in quick succession. The 4-point buck, grazing beyond his companion, leaped high in the air and lurched out across the meadow. The 2-point whirled about and stood for a second with his head up. More shots thundered, and the 2-point humped his back and lowered his head. Staggering uncertainly, he started off. Once underway, he bounded off across the meadow. The 4-point went only a few yards. He had turned halfway around and plunged to the ground. Yellow Eyes controlled a panic within him, which urged him to leap out into the meadow and bound across it. The fate of the 2 bucks warned him that he must not take to the open country. Doubling like a yellow flash, he slipped into the timber. As he ran, he saw 3 men rush from the woods toward the prostrate buck. Yellow Eyes waited to see no more. He slid through the timber toward the densest growth of spruce on the ridge. He had seen his first kill by men armed with high-powered rifles. The 4-day deer season was on, and the hills were full of hunters out for buck. Skirting the clearing, he crossed a trail which made him snarl angrily. It was the trail of the 2-point, and it was marked with blood. Crimson splashes soaked the dry leaves and splattered over the bare twigs. The 2-point had been badly hit. The cougar slid down through the timber rapidly. He was heading for a rough slide choked with dense underbrush and tumbled boulders. Many times he had lain in the fastness of this retreat and slept. He came to the place and clambered over the big rocks until he was well hidden in its inaccessible recesses. He was moving silently over a big rock when he smelled fresh blood. His neck scruff lifted, and he halted. Testing the wind, he edged toward the fresh kill the odor indicated. In a hollow between 2 great slabs of rock, he came upon the 2-point buck. The buck was down, his head thrashing back and forth, wind hissing from his nostrils, his mouth open as he gasped. The hunter's bullet had torn a great hole in his side, and he was rapidly bleeding to death. Yellow Eyes snarled and stood watching. He edged to cover and waited, listening. He was afraid the man who had struck down the young buck would trail him. Nothing happened, and the cougar settled himself to wait and watch. An hour passed. The 2-point ceased to toss his head. His short antlers sank back into the black earth, and his eyes glazed. The sun came out and beat down upon the carcass, but Yellow Eyes did not move. He sat for 3 more hours and watched. He did not know that the hunters had gone on around the ridge in search of other game. The 2-point was not worth the trouble of a long chase. Their search of the woods across from where they had been on stand had been brief and casual. All through the morning, rifles cracked. On every ridge he heard them. Their thunder made him uneasy, and his black flag tail twitched angrily as each report rolled in around him. Finally, he got down and approached the deer. He spent some time in walking around it, but finally leaped upon it and tore at the fresh venison. He had not eaten of a deer since his mother's death, and he was ravenously hungry for it. He gorged himself until he could eat no more. Then he kicked a few sticks over the carcass and wandered deep into the tangled jumble of rocks and undergrowth. Locating a niche underneath a great rock, he lay down and fell asleep. The next day he did not hunt, but stationed himself on a ledge overlooking the valley. He saw many men riding or walking, each carried a rifle, and the quiet of the woods was broken repeatedly by the thunder of their guns. The bucks were running madly from ridge to ridge, unable to find safety in any of the haunts they had known during the summer. On every ridge they were met with blazing guns when they broke cover. Men rose out of the thickets along the trail and fired upon them. Hundreds went down, and scores plunged away to slow deaths from loss of blood under great spruce. Stark fear clutched the high country. Every dweller of the wild hid himself, and even that dull gnawer of bark, the porcupine, sought haven in the limbs of a spruce. At the end of the fourth day, peace settled again upon the high country. The guns of the hunters were silent, and the men no longer scoured the ridges. Yellow Eyes kept close to his supply of venison during those days. None of the hunters attempted to enter the tangled fastness of his retreat, though many passed above and below it. That's the end of chapter 6.